including white people in the civil rights movement, whereas the black power movement believed in excluding white people from the movement. Okay, you want me to repeat all four of those one more time for you? Yay, nay? Okay, all right. All right, let's move on to the next subtopic then. And we have not talked about the Vietnam War yet, but we will, and I think you have enough of an idea what it was, that we're going to go to Martin Luther King Jr. and the Vietnam War. What were Martin Luther King Jr. and the philosophies of the SCLC, what were their philosophies towards our war in Vietnam? Now, I'm going to give you a little bit, don't write this down, just listen, I'm going to give you a little bit of history. In the 1950s, Vietnam, South Vietnam, belonged to the French. Okay? North Vietnam was communist, South Vietnam was non-communist. And in the 1950s, early 1950s, the French had control. Well, they got tired of the continuing hassle between the two, so what they do? They left. Just left them out, they left out of the country. Well, when President Eisenhower was in office, he did not want to see the domino effect in Asia. What do I mean by the domino effect in Asia? Yeah, one nation falls to communism, they're all going to fall. And he did not want to see South Vietnam fall to communism. Just during the Korean War, just years before that, we had the same battle. We had North Korea and South Korea, and the same thing. We were concerned about South Korea becoming communist, and we had a war called the Korean War that solved that problem, so to speak. Well, Eisenhower saw the same thing in Vietnam. So Eisenhower was willing to send military advisors to South Vietnam so they could protect themselves from becoming communist. Okay? When Kennedy took over the presidency, he inherited that. And he'll send some more advisors. But historians will tell you that Kennedy would have never gone to the extent that Johnson did as far as committing American troops in Vietnam. Because he said in an interview with Walter Cronkite just weeks before he was assassinated that it's their war to win or lose. So historians will tell you that if Kennedy would remain president, the deal in Vietnam may have totally changed. Okay? Well, when Johnson got in, he committed American troops to Vietnam and was going to win this war. He did not want to see South Vietnam become communist, and it didn't work out so well for him. Okay? And we'll talk more about that. But anyway, in May of 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke for the first time about the Vietnam War. It started in like '64 with American troops and advisors going in. So this is like 3 years into the Vietnam War, and it's kind of getting ugly. Okay? You got protesters around the country. You have not had the Tet Offensive yet, which was the turning point in the Vietnam War as far as American attitudes. But you had some backlash. You had some Americans that didn't think that Vietnam was the thing. But Martin Luther King Jr. kept his opinions to himself until May of 1967. And this is when he began to speak against the Vietnam War. Okay? Now, at one time, the Vietnam War was costing us $1 million a day to fight. And what did Martin Luther King Jr. think that money would be better used for? Helping the civil rights problem in America. So that was the criticism that Martin Luther King came out with first. He believed that the money that was spent on the Vietnam War ought to be used at home in the United States to not only fight the civil rights movement, but to fight poverty. That was his concern, right? So here's Lyndon Johnson, who makes a stage of the Great Society that he's going to help people out of poverty, which I think he really meant to do, but he's spending $1 million a day at the high point of the Vietnam War on the war. And Martin Luther King didn't think that was right. He thought we should spend that money to help people fight poverty in the United States. Now, why is this an issue? Why is this really not probably a good move for Martin Luther King Jr. to come out and say this? A couple of reasons, but what would be your thought process? That's right. Johnson was his biggest ally in the civil rights movement. He did more for civil rights than anybody up to that time, and several presidents afterwards. But what he did is he drove a wedge between himself and President Johnson by criticizing his ideas in Vietnam. And although he was probably right, it really did hurt Martin Luther King's civil rights movement because Johnson was upset at his comments. Okay? Now, what do you think his own supporters felt about him coming out and saying that? Not so much. Why? Because they knew that he was going to draw a wedge between him and Johnson. He knew that his views on the war would take away from his efforts in the civil rights movement. And did these people in the civil rights movement believe the war was their struggle? What was their struggle? What was the SCLC's struggle? What were Black Power members' struggle? Was it the Vietnam War? No, their struggle was how to provide equal opportunities for African Americans in the United States. So he made his comments in May of 1967, but his official speech that he gave, in which he officially spoke out publicly, was on April 4th, 1967. So on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King gave a speech in which he officially spoke out against the Vietnam War and President Johnson. He gave that speech in New York City. So what does he lose besides the support of President Johnson by speaking out against the Vietnam War? He loses, we talked about, some support of what? His present supporters. Okay, he loses some support of the present followers. Okay, so he's going to lose some support of the nonviolent philosophy of civil rights. Now where do you think they're going to go? Over the Black Power side. What else is he going to lose? If you lose supporters, what do you lose? Money. Very good, Emily. He lost financial support for the civil rights movement. And what did he get himself involved in by making those comments instead of the civil rights movement? He got himself involved in foreign policy. And that was not good, because people that were in the civil rights movement didn't care about foreign policy. What did they care about? Domestic policy, especially the civil rights movement. So his outspoken views hurt the civil rights movement by losing support of his present followers. He lost financial support for the civil rights movement with those statements. And a lot of Americans were upset at him because they thought he should stay out of foreign affairs and worry about the things that happened in the country. So, after being criticized, after that speech, King became very depressed individual. And he made this comment that I'd like you to write down publicly. That it kind of sums up what's going to happen with him in the future. So during the summer of 1967, Dr. King became very depressed after he started to lose support because of these comments. And this is a comment that he said publicly. See what you think about what he means. It's a pretty interesting quote. He said, I'll repeat it several times. He says, quote, "I must confess that the dream I had that day has in many points turned into a nightmare. I must confess that the dream that I had that day has in many points turned into a nightmare." Again, I must confess that the dream I had that day has in many points turned into a nightmare. So what's he figuring out in the summer of 1967? That this is an uphill battle on civil rights, right? Okay, he's losing supporters, the Black Power movement's making a stand, and he says, I must confess that the dream I had that day has in many points turned into a nightmare. Okay, just kind of trying to figure things out for me. How many are not going to be here tomorrow for sure? Okay, we got a few, we'll see what happens. All right, I think what we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to watch a video called King. And it talks about these things. For those of you that aren't here, you'll have to borrow it, or I can make you a copy. I've got it at home on my DVR if you're interested. Then when we get back on Monday, we're going to talk about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which was an unbelievable time in American history. We're going to talk about a profile on Dr. King. Then I'm going to give you some notes so you don't have to take them on the capturing of King's assassin. And then we're going to talk about the 1968 Olympic Games. Okay? So those that are here the next 2 days will be watching a video called King. Okay?